So what I'm going to cover now is the Retopo room and how do you go from the voxel room to the Retopo room. The question might be, well, why are you going from voxel to Retopo? Why aren't these going from like left to right or something like that, or step one, step two? And that's because your workflow may change. You may decide that you're going to Retopo an existing model or bring something in from another application and not even worry about voxels. So that is an option. But in this case, we're going to work with voxels. So what I've done here is I've sculpted a loaf of bread, but it has no geometry. So if I put on wireframe, you can see it's all in voxels. But I need it to have geometry in order to do any kind of UV unwrapping, painting on it, texture work, and to export it. And so, and that's not technically true. I could export it with the existing triangles or whatever, but I don't want a 600,000 poly, loaf of bread. And while there are ways to reduce it, it may not be the flow of topology that I want. So there are a couple ways to deal with this. One is to go directly into the Retopo room and retopo it the way I've done here, which is giving it a low polygon representation of the high poly sculpt. In fact, let me go to the paint room and you can see the end result of what could happen. You could actually paint in your specularity or shininess, your texture work or whatever. And if you look at the actual geometry underneath it, it's just the low poly mesh. So in this case, let me turn this off for a second. We'll go into the voxel room and turn on our topology. And you'll see down here that I actually have, it's a 296 quad, 596 triangles. So in other words, quads turn into triangles with a line cut from one corner to the other. That's what this is representing, and that's exactly what I was after. So I've given it some areas where I've given some indentations, some bumps to represent the geometry, even though it's not exactly like what you see in fact, hold on, the voxel here. I've got some bumpiness in here, but I don't need to represent all those. I just want those to be normal maps. But I may decide to do some displacement. So either use a displacement map or just model it in like this to have these bumps, bumpy areas or indentations. So this geometry is put on what's called a group. Now, normally the Voxtree tab isn't in this room. I had to go to Windows, Pop-ups, Voxtree, and drag it in here. And I highly recommend doing this. In fact, I wish it was there by default. Because, like layers, your Retopo work goes on this group layer. And so if I were to do a new one, I could do several versions of retopologizing this same model. But the one thing I want to make sure of is that the naming scheme for the one that I want to use is exactly like what is in the Voxtree. And I can't think of a reason not to do this. The reason you want to do this is if, let's say I have several loaves of bread sitting beside each other, if I don't name these groups the same name as the layer they're representing in the Voxtree, then when I go to bake the information, the lighting information into it, I'm going to get shadows from the ones that sit beside it into this particular loaf of bread that I didn't want there. And that way, if I just wanted to use that loaf of bread, I'd be stuck with those occluded lighting built into its texture. And while I can choose not to use that lighting, I still want the ambient occlusion done. So a way around that is, let's say I had three of these side by side. If let's say it's bread loaf LOD 1, bread loaf LOD 2, bread loaf LOD 3, and my groups were named the same way for my retopos for each one of those, then if I go into Retopo and bake the texture or send it to the paint room, then it will do them individually, but all at the same time, if that makes any sense. It will bake them individually, but it's all one process. The couple things that you need to make sure happen here, though, is that you check this use names correspondence for baking, and that you check your groups and volumes for correspondence to make sure that they match up. If they match up, you'll get this, where it says they correspond. If for some reason I didn't name one properly, and then I go in and say check, it'll mention which one or list the ones that are not matched up with an appropriate layer. So it's helpful to have that on. And so now that that's been done, you kind of get a sense of what the Retopo room is for. I'll show you basically how to do your own Retopo, give you kind of a brief introduction to that. And so what I'm going to do is create a new layer. I'm going to erase my old one. And again, I want to name it the same thing. Now, if I double click on this group name, I can name it by typing it in, or because I have Voxtree tab in here, I'll just double click on that, press Control C, and then press Control V over here, and it will copy it in. And let me pull up my helper here so that we can see what I'm pressing and what I'm doing. That having been said, if I'm gonna, it's just like the voxel room. I can't start with nothing and sculpt from it. Well, the same thing with the Retopo room. I can't start with nothing and actually start having geometry built in, with a few exceptions. So let's say I want to build in my own geometry by hand. I literally can do that with a series of different tools that allow me to go in and start building geometry onto it. I can even use certain features like the points and faces here, where I had drawn in points with my left mouse button and then right clicked in the middle here where it shows a represented quad or try, and that right click will commit it to the scene. Well, if I hold down my control key and float over one of these edges here, I can cut a span across it. So there's different functions and features that'll occur for these different tools. So points and faces does what it looked like. Quads, and again, the options up here are context sensitive. So I'll get a certain number of options up here for points and faces. And for quads, it's very noticeable because in this case, I've got a 2 clicks method, which means I click on the edge I want to stretch out, left click here, and I've got a quad. But I could also use, say, the direct method, which basically means I click on my edge I want to stretch out and just float over, and then it'll snap to whatever vertices are near. And sometimes this is hypersensitive, sometimes it's not, and so you can adjust the snap force as you see fit. Another thing you may notice is as I'm doing this, this geometry changes color, and that's helpful when, let's say you're working from 2 different ends of this loaf of bread, then you want to make sure that if your geometry is attached, they are the same color. If they're on an island like this one floating out on its own, that it's a different color, and you can recognize that visually. But keep in mind that this color information is just for visual purposes only. It's not texturing your bread pink, blue, whatever. There's nothing to do with that at all. Cap basically is what it sounds like. It'll start, so if I had, say, a circle at the end here and I needed to close it off, I can use cap and right click to commit that change. Strokes is a very different thing. So let me, I'm gonna create a new layer because you always have to have one in here. You can't have no group layers in here. But if I delete my original work here and go back to this other one, and just for practice, we'll just copy this name from the Vox tree over to the groups tab here. Strokes is a little bit different. Strokes are guides, and so I can take, say, a line and draw it across. Now notice I can flex this line at any angle I want. If I hold down my shift key though, it keeps it pinned to the same relative path. And so I can cut a line down that way. I can even turn on my symmetry, and whatever I do to, and actually let me show my symmetry plane, whatever I do to one side, it should do to the other. So I don't actually have to retopologize this whole loaf of bread if it is symmetrical. I can literally just go in and say draw a line like this, and where these cross paths, as long as they make a quad or a triangle, then it should work. So in this case, let's say I go down this way, and it also has to have, now obviously you can't have a triangle bend like this. You can't have a quad bend like this. You need to think about things like that when you're drawing in your strokes. Notice also that my stroke in that case turned green, and that's because I don't have to have a full stroke. I can just stroke along an edge and just suggest the workflow without actually having to go all the way across. When you're dealing with strokes, though, I would say in most cases, make sure you're in orthographic mode, which again is, if you look at your graph, it should be straight. Your line should be more or less straight. If I go into perspective mode, it's more like that. So I suggest the orthographic mode. And again, if you hold down Alt and then Shift, it'll snap to whatever, top, bottom, side, whatever you need. So in this case, I can see already I'm going to have a problem here because there's not enough quads I can't have a quad bend like that. So maybe what I'll do is I'll start from the outside. So my line is orange and just cut it through there. And the reason the orange matters is it's not like, as you can see through this ghosting, it cuts a line right through here. But I'm not as concerned about all of that, except for there are times when you're going to want to use the orange line. There are times when you're going to want to just suggest a stroke. So at this point, I'm going to hit enter, and it will do the best job it can to calculate out what I was trying to do. Now, in this particular case, it's not going to be great because I've got too much going on. It may be that I didn't want to use those orange lines. And so there are some risks associated with and disadvantages associated with doing your orange lines that stop in the middle of your model. If you're cutting all the way through, they're beneficial. But in this case, let's say I just want like quads going like this, okay? Then I can hit enter, and where I have quads suggested, it will draw them out. The only problem is, and again, let me turn my grid off. Again, let me ghost my voxel, and you can see I have a polygon buried in it that I didn't want there. So what I'll do is I'll go to delete polygons and just delete that and these as well. And notice whatever happened on this side happened on this side. So that's why your symmetry plane is very useful if you have a symmetrical model. So in this case, it probably would have been better, instead of using your symmetry on that axis, is to do it, say, on your z-axis, because it's probably more symmetrical that way. But keep in mind that it just changed. It took what was on my left side over here, and because I haven't actually committed the changes on both sides, I can dynamically change it to both sides this way. And to commit it, I go up to Retopo and say apply symmetry to the current layer, this group layer here. So if I apply the symmetry, now if I turn off my symmetry plane by pressing S and going to no symmetry, you'll see that I have symmetry on both sides committed. I have the changes committed on both sides, but they're two different colors because there's two separate islands of geometry there. So I've given you kind of an intro to dealing with the Retopo room in the respect to adding in geometry. But you can also mark UV seams here as well. Now this is stuff that you normally would leave to the program itself to do automatically or to do in the UV room, but UVs are extremely easy to do. So for instance, let me go back to my original file where I had already retopoed this loaf of bread. In fact, let me go to the paint room really quick and turn off the paintwork that I did. And we'll look at this, and let me turn off my voxels so that we can see this more clearly. Now, if I want to mark seams, it may be that I want to mark seams here and maybe along here. And so what I did there was I can literally left click and just draw in my seams, a little hard because that's green on green, draw in my seams along a path if I want. I could do a UV path where I'm just going point to point to point to point to point. If I hit enter, it'll commit that. Or what I can do is hold down, if I want it to mark a seam across a whole area, hold down shift. And so that's all I did here, is if I mark my seam, and as long as that loop goes all the way around, or even if it doesn't, if I hold down shift, it'll go to the very end of where it loops all the way around, or ends at least. So once that's done, I can mark my seam there, and now I've got like UV islands already cut really quickly. If I don't like it that way, and let's say I want to cut it this way and then do my UV seams, I can do it that way. So it's really fast to cut these things out. And usually what I would do in this case is maybe I would cut my seam there, and where I could see that this would bend, I'll probably cut a seam there, or maybe up here. So what you'll see is if I cut my seam down here and float my cursor over this UV island, I get a representation of it on the right here. And it's a preview. And so before I've unwrapped these UVs, you can see where it's red and where it's white. Where it's darker red, and the darker red colors are more problematic areas. Where they're lighter or white, they're less problematic or not problematic at all. So in this case, this would work out really well. If I look at this one, it's going to try and unwrap this seam, this part of my mesh as a loop, but I might want to just cut a slice right there. And you see it went from having some red to just being white. The other thing I could do is do a planar unwrap. If I wanted, I could select certain areas and then do a planar unwrap, or LCSM, LSCM, ABF, etc. You can even relax your seams, do all kinds of stuff. So having done this, if I just want to keep this like this, right? And if they're pink like this, it's not a big deal. It's just when they're dark red, and even sometimes when they're a dark pink, it can be problematic. But then at that point, you can just say unwrap. And what that does is it does exactly what I said. It unwraps it. Now you'll notice that my solid colors went to checker, which gives you a light map, or I should say a texture map, that represents the flow of your seams. And you can literally go in here and adjust the width, scale, rotation of your UV islands. You can adjust points to point, vertices, and move them manually if you want. Another thing you can do is pack UV. And if I click on that, it'll pack them in any number of ways. And there's different packing algorithms here, and you can also scale them or auto scale them. But until you update the islands, it will not, these UV seams and layout will not be committed to the UV room. Now, another way to do this, let's say, let me back all the way out of here, and let's say I wanted to just let it automatically do this. I can literally just hit auto seams, and it'll cut in, or draw out, I should say, the UV seams where they need to be. And then I can just say update islands, and it'll do just that. My UV map will be squared away. But in this case, what I did is I didn't bother with the UV seams. I just let it do it for me, even though now I will probably go back and do it manually. At the time, I just said merge with normal map per pixel, which means I would have to be able to paint on my model with a normal mapping in place, or I can just paint on it, or I can paint with displacement in place. But there are different features here to send it to the paint room. But I did merge with NM per pixel, which is normal map per pixel. And if I go to voxels, I'm sorry, not voxels, the UV room, you'll see that my UVs are already set up for me. So when I pressed the merge with NM, I'm saying I want to use normal mapping information and send it to the paint room. It automatically kicks the UVs over to the UV room, and I don't even see that part of the workflow. It just does it, and then it sends it to the paint room, where I literally can go in and paint in textures like this, with shininess, bumping, and different kinds of features that you can use in the paint room. So that is the UV room in a nutshell. One other thing I want to point out is that if you have multiple groups, just like in the Vox tree, you can move these layers up and down as you see fit. But there's no right-clicking. You can hide them, you can show them, and you can move them around. There's the delete layer. There is the subdivide, so I can literally subdivide a layer to increase my geometry there, so it'll bake better if I need to. But I may not want to do that. That's up to me. Make the symmetrical copy of that layer. Select all the faces, move the selected faces to the current layer. So in other words, if I had gone into in fact, let me hide this paint version here and go over to the Retopo room. If I select, say this, in fact, let me just go to faces. If I select these faces and I want to move them to another layer, then I can select these faces on this one, go to this one, and then say move. And what will happen is those have now been moved to this new layer. And then the other thing I can do is delete all the polygons from that layer. So that's the Retopo room. Next up is going to be the UV room.